Hey, everybody, can you hear me?
Hey, Aldo, how are you? Oh my gosh, I owe you a text.
Been waiting.
I saw it and I'm like, oh God, I gotta get a name.
It's all good.
I have the last name. I just don't recall the first name. So
That's right. You got a lot going on. Don't worry. Present.
Commissioner Saudi,
Present.
Vice Chair Privatali,
Here.
and Chair Samudzi.
And I'm here.
And I just want to note that Commissioner Lubomirsky is absent today.
Thank you. We'll move on to the order of the agenda. Are there any changes to the order of the agenda? The order may only be changed by a majority vote. Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the meeting procedures. So due to COVID-19 shelter-in-place order, we've had to establish new ways of conducting our public meetings. I'd like to ask staff to address how public comment will work this evening.
Thank you, Chair Samudzi. At this time, I just want to make sure that staff has turned off all their cameras and then we only have myself and the commissioners on. This meeting is being streamed live to YouTube, where viewers can provide comments in live chat by going to www.youtube.com/City of Santa Fe or by phone at 669-900-9128. And you can enter the meeting ID, which is 872-0645-4435 #. In addition, I want to make note that we are offering closed caption streaming of this meeting. The link to the closed captioning service can be found in the YouTube live chat box. Those who would like to provide comment on YouTube will need to have a Google account, but you can do that by creating at accounts.google.com. If you're participating by phone tonight and you wish to provide comment, you're going to first need to press the star button and 9. And when the chair opens up the public comment period, you can go ahead and begin speaking by pressing star 6 to unmute yourself. Once you are unmuted, you can start a 3 minutes of a comment period. Please make sure when you do that to turn off the volume of all other devices if you're watching YouTube live so that you don't get feedback or an audio delay. If you are providing comments on YouTube, you can do so by first writing public comment in all caps. You're going to introduce yourself and submit your comments in groups of no more than 200 characters. YouTube has a character limit, and you're going to be allowed to provide 3 minutes worth of text. Comments will be read as submitted. However, words including profanity, obscenities, or discriminatory language or that disturb the decorum of the meeting will not be read into the record. If you have submitted comments prior to this meeting, they have been provided to the Planning Commission and published to our website. That's it.
Thanks, Allie. So let me now describe the meeting procedures. We'll start with the staff report, then we will hear from the applicant. Applicant, please try to keep your presentation to no more than 10 minutes. After that, the members of public will be invited to speak. We will read any comments that are made into the YouTube live chat, and people on the conference call can speak when they receive notification that they have been unmuted. For members of the public, please keep your comments to 3 minutes. After that, commission will have the opportunity to ask questions of staff, the applicant, or the public after each segment. We will then close the public hearing and bring the matter back to the commission for discussion and action if necessary. In terms of urgent communication, is there anyone with an urgent communication on a topic not on the agenda? You may address the commission at this time.
Okay, as I mentioned, if you're wishing to provide public comment on something that is not on the agenda, you can do so by pressing star 9 on your phone, and I will let you know when it's time to speak. I see nobody. Looks like there's one person. I'm going to go ahead and Michelle, I do not have the ability to. There we go. I think thank you. So I think you may press star 6 at this time. Should be able to begin speaking.
Good evening. I have a suggestion for those of us who are in the car or traveling without the ability to, am I on?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Without the ability to see your faces, perhaps before you speak, you could identify yourself so we would know, those of us who are flying blind here would know who we're talking to.
Thank you. That's a fair comment.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to speak? If there is, please do so by pressing *9 on your phone to raise your hand. I do not see anybody else, and I'm just looking to see if there's anybody on the chat, and I do not see anyone on the chat at this time.
Okay, thanks again. We'll now move on to the consent calendar, which has one item, which are the minutes from February 23rd, 2021, and our last commission meeting hearing. The item is just the approval of the meeting minutes from that last meeting. Are there any comments from the public on the consent calendar?
So if there's anyone in the conference call that's wishing to provide comments on the minutes, you can do so by pressing *9 to virtually raise your hand. And I'm looking to see if there's anybody virtually raising your hand, and there is nobody. And I do not see anyone in the chat.
Okay. Are there any comments or edits by any members of the commission? And if not, I will entertain a motion. Please announce yourself when you do.
This is Commissioner Sadi. I'll motion to approve the minutes.
Commissioner Davidson, second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All right, hearing none, I'll ask staff to conduct roll call, please.
Okay, Commissioner Davidson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mercado,
I'll abstain.
Commissioner Saudi,
Yes.
Vice Chair Privatali,
Yes.
and Chair Samudzi.
Yes. Okay, great. We'll move on to tonight's item for the public hearing. Tonight's item, we are reviewing the General Plan 2040 and Downtown Precise Plan Draft Environmental Impact Report. And our focus here is to accept public comments on the draft EIR. At this point, I'll request a staff report.
Great. Good evening, commissioners. I will be beginning the staff report this evening, and my colleagues from PlaceWorks, our EIR consultant, will be joining me. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going with that. And I am Barry Miller, the Consulting Project Manager for General Plan 2040. Just bringing up my full screen here. All right, and just wanting to confirm everyone can see the screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Great, and good evening again. This evening's hearing is intended to take public comment on the draft environmental impact report for General Plan 2040 and for the Downtown Precise Plan. This is actually the 8th hearing the Commission has convened on the project since last September. The first 4 hearings focused on the general plan update, the next 3 focused on the Downtown Precise Plan, and this evening we'll be turning our attention to the draft environmental impact report for the DEIR. I'd like to start with some brief introductions and explain the purpose of the meeting. We're going to do a quick project overview, primarily for the benefit of those who may be watching the hearing or listening to the hearing on YouTube or Zoom. I will then be turning it over to the EIR consultants who will give you some background on the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and walk you through the conclusions of the draft EIR. Following the presentation, the Commission will invite the public to comment on the EIR. The comments will be annotated and considered as part of the record for the project, and written responses will be provided as part of the final EIR. You will be hearing from our EIR consultants in just a moment. Steve Nowak from PlaceWorks is the principal in charge of the project. Tarina Wilson is our project manager. I also want to acknowledge Terry McCracken, who couldn't be here this evening and has also worked very hard on this document. There were a number of sub-consultants who prepared specific sections of the EIR, including Fair and Peers, who prepared the transportation section, Tom Orager Associates, who did the cultural resources section, and the Environmental Collaborative, who prepared the biological resources section. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the Precise Plan team participants, although they weren't involved in the EIR directly. Both Garavalia Associates, who did the historic preservation work on the Precise Plan, and Opticos Design, who you've heard from before, the prime consultant on the Precise Plan, also were engaged in the process. And of course, you know your staff team, myself and Allie and Paul Jensen, our Community Development Director. The EIR covers two projects, the General Plan 2040 and the Downtown Precise Plan. The way the document is structured is that for each impact category that's addressed, we first address the impacts of adoption of the general plan, and then address the impacts of adopting the Downtown Precise Plan for that same subject area, which looks more locally at downtown impacts. In many cases, the findings are the same, and the mitigation measures that have been developed for general plan impacts also apply to the Downtown Precise Plan area. As a reminder, the study area covered by the EIR is larger than the city of San Rafael itself. It includes it includes the city of San Rafael plus the sphere of influence, which includes the unincorporated pockets like Los Ranchitos and Country Club and Santa Venetia. And it includes the planning area beyond the sphere, which would be Lucas Valley and Marinwood, the area in the upper left of your screen here. The Commission's role in this process is to review the draft EIR and the project itself. The previous meetings you've had focused on the project, and tonight we're focusing strictly on the EIR. The public hearing that you're holding tonight is required by CEQA. At the hearing, you'll receive comments on the draft EIR from the community. You will also have an opportunity after the public comment to provide your own comments on the EIR and to ask questions of the consulting team and staff. After the meeting, we will be preparing responses to comments on the EIR and edits and changes to the EIR that may be needed to respond to those comments, and then findings for the Commission's consideration at a future meeting. As we've gone over before, we'll also be bringing a revised version of the General Plan 2040 and Precise Plan with changes and edits that respond to the comments that we've received so far. When we return to you, you'll be considering both a resolution to forward the EIR to the City Council for consideration and separate resolutions to approve the draft General Plan and the draft Precise Plan. So again, to recap for tonight, the purpose is to receive comments from the public, different organizations and interested agencies who wish to comment on the EIR, to bookmark this process. The photo that you're seeing on the screen here is actually from the beginning of the process. This is our scoping session on the EIR that was held in April 2019. I see 3 of the current sitting commissioners in this photo. And some of you may recall that now it's been almost 2 years since we issued the notice of preparation and held this initial scoping session. With that, I'm going to introduce Steve Nowak from PlaceWorks, and Steve will walk us through the little more background on the EIR, and then Tarina Wilson will go over the impacts. Steve?
Thank you very much, Barry. Good evening, planning commissioners. I'm going to just present a brief overview of CEQA to kind of give a context for the EIR and how important it is to this whole general plan process. So CEQA is the state's primary environmental protection law. It's really an informational document which discloses the potential environmental impacts of a project where there's a potential for a physical effect. It also identifies mitigation measures when required and describes feasible alternatives to the proposed project. And that is to address impact where we found that there's a potential for a significant effect. It's really important to note, and I'm sure that the commission knows this, but for benefit of everybody, CEQA does not dictate project approval or denial. It's truly a disclosure document. It's not unusual for a project to have an impact that can't be fully mitigated, but oftentimes, looking at the benefits of the project, as long as that is disclosed and there's still some level of mitigation, that's an appropriate means of moving forward with the project. Next slide. And in the case of the general plan, we're preparing a program level EIR, and it's really looking at reviewing documents when a project consists of a series of actions related to the issuance of rules, regulations, and other planning criteria. A general plan, including changes to the land use map, land use policies, and other policies, consists of a series of actions. The programmatic EIR does not evaluate the impacts of future construction level projects. It does allow subsequent projects at the project level to tier off of the document. So it's very important that the general plan EIR really look at the broad level of potential impact based on the build-out projections of the project and include mitigation measures that would allow for some level of mitigation in order for future projects to move through. And I think general plan EIRs have really become important at that level because there's a lot of emphasis of infill projects and really, promoting more compact housing and other development types. And with an adequate EIR that addresses the build out at this level, that's something that can be achieved here. Next slide. So we are in the middle of the public comment or public response period for the EIR process. The first public meeting was the scoping meeting, and now we're at the 45-day public review period. This is the end of the period today. We will take the comments we've received up till now and the comments from the commission and the public tonight, put those into the final EIR. Then we will, at the planning commission meeting, will be another opportunity for the public to comment on the final EIR as well as the general plan. Then that proceeds with a recommendation to the city council for the final EIR certification. The EIR looked at overall build out at a pretty conservative level. And so again, by providing mitigation for this level of build out, it does help for future projects to go through with being able to tier off the recommendations for mitigation through this document. The total households was 4,250, total residential units was 4,460, and that difference is because of vacant units in residential units. An increase in population over the 20-year period of 8,910, and increase in employees to 4,115. So we really did look at the total potential that could occur with the changes in the plan in this EIR. Next slide. And then the EIR does look at the full range of environmental topics. Each of these topics has specific threshold questions that need to be addressed as part of the evaluation. And so it's important that we address each of these specifically. Kind of makes for a very long document, but again, it really will benefit the city in the long run in terms of future development and future control of development. Next slide. When we look at environmental impacts, when we identify potential environmental impacts, which means one of the threshold questions shows that there's a potential for an impact, then the EIR looks at whether it can be avoided, minimized, rectified, reduced or eliminated or compensated. And that's really where the mitigation process comes in. And the EIR includes numerous mitigation measures when applied again at the project level will help to avoid or reduce the potential for environmental impacts with future development. And then also, CEQA permits the general plan to incorporate mitigation measures as goals, policies, and actions. And in this case, the city has taken on many actions from this general plan to implement down the road, which again will help in terms of addressing future environmental impacts. Next slide. So overall, the EIR found a less than significant impact, meaning that the total impact can be reduced to a less than significant level in the key areas of air quality, biological resources, cultural and tribal cultural resources, although both air quality and cultural resources, certain significant criteria was still found to be significant and unavoidable. Geology and soils, hazards and hazardous materials, noise and vibration. And then in terms of impacts that were found to be significant and unavoidable, meaning that even with mitigation, they couldn't be reduced to a less than significant level. These included one air quality impact, I believe one tribal and cultural resources impact, greenhouse gas emissions, and transportation. Next slide. So in order for the, when the commission gets to the decision-making process and looking at the ultimate outcome of the environmental determinations and finds that certain impacts are significant and unavoidable, then it will be through a statement of overriding considerations, again, which looks at the a number of benefits versus the environmental impact. It's a full disclosure process, looks at the mitigation measures, the effectiveness of that, and really just then allows the project to move forward with this full disclosure that it can't be fully mitigated. Next slide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Torina, who will go through each of the impact discussions in the EIR, as well as discussing the alternatives and the cumulative impacts.
Great, thank you, Steve, and good evening, commissioners. My name is Torina Wilson, and I'm the project manager for the draft EIR. Tonight, I'll be giving you a rundown of some of the mitigation measures which were included in the EIR, specifically those which called for new or modified programs to be adopted as part of the general plan update. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order, starting with air quality. The air quality analysis resulted in mitigation measures which would require 4 new general plan programs. These programs would require that future proposed development which would exceed screening criteria set by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, would be required to undergo project-specific mitigation to reduce emissions that would result from construction or operation. The new programs would also require that a construction health risk assessment be conducted for any projects that are within 1,000 feet of existing sensitive receptors. One example of that is homes. And then it would also require that some projects go through a diesel truck health risk assessment in cases where there's a project proposed which is industrial or warehousing or commercial and would involve heavy use of diesel trucks or diesel equipment. Next slide, please. So mitigations related to biological resources either strengthened existing programs or required new ones. These would include ensuring that biological resource surveys are conducted for a wider range of riparian habitats, as well as any sensitive natural communities around regulated waters. It would also require that the avoidance of any nesting birds occurs for any construction activities. It would require that biological surveys are conducted for wildlife movement corridors, along with new considerations for bird collision risk assessments, which are usually done through bird safe design guidelines. Next slide, please. The cultural and tribal cultural resources analysis yielded both new programs and modifications to existing programs, just like biological resources. These include modifications to the Historic Preservation Ordinance, specifically to include updated procedures to mitigate impacts from any demolition, destruction, or alteration of a historic resource. There's another modified program which would require changes to the city's Archaeological Resources Ordinance to include construction best management practices in cases where such a resource is encountered during ground disturbing activities. There is not a slide in this presentation for geology and soils mitigation, but there's one mitigation measure in the draft EIR identified for geology and soils, which would require the same protection, but for paleontological resources. And then one new program is included for cultural resources, and that would ensure that future projects that encounter human remains during ground disturbing activities must be treated in accordance with applicable existing regulations. Next slide, please. There are two programs which would be required for hazards and hazardous materials. These would require that environmental site management plans are completed for projects which are proposed on sites that have any known hazardous materials contamination. And then it would also require that soil vapor intrusion assessments are conducted for sites with potential residual contamination in either soil or groundwater. Next slide. The new and modified policy program mitigation measures related to noise and vibration are pretty standard for this type of project. They would require the use of best management practices to reduce impacts that project construction could have on neighboring land uses. And this includes both noise and vibration impacts from heavy machinery. The new and modified policies would also require that the city adopt standard conditions of approval related to construction and ground-borne vibration. Next slide. There is only one modified program related to transportation, and that one's focused on the switch to vehicle miles traveled, which we know has become in effect under SB 375, and subsequent techniques for reducing vehicle miles traveled. Next slide. Now, in the environmental topics chapters, we also have to include what's called a cumulative impact finding, which determines physical impacts on the environment that would occur as a result of all known potential development in the EIR study area, along with all known or potential development in neighboring jurisdictions. In most cases, the EIR analysis found that there's not any cumulatively considerable impacts. However, the draft EIR did find that there's cumulatively considerable impacts that could potentially occur in relation to air quality from project operation, in relation to I apologize. Steve, could you maybe take over the rest?
Yes, no problem. So the EIR did find potential cumulative impacts for air quality, long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction, and the regional vehicle miles traveled. Next slide, Barry. The EIR did look at alternatives to the project, including a no project alternative, which is required by CEQA. And the no project alternative really would just look at continued development under the general plan. And as you could see, it still includes additional development over what is on the ground today. Alternative B looked at increasing the residential growth for the project. So the number of households, residential units, population were higher. The number of employees overall were lower. Alternative C looked at a lower residential growth with a pretty much the same employee development or employee growth as today. Next slide. And CEQA requires that the EIR identify an environmentally superior alternative. And, you know, oftentimes the no project is identified as the environmentally superior alternative, only because, as you saw in the previous slide, the overall growth, projected growth would be much lower than what's projected for the EIR. And in this case, looking at the evaluation, comparing all the differences in impact between the alternative and the project itself in each of the categories on a objective level, found that alternative B resulted in the reduced environmental impact, reducing air quality, energy, greenhouse gas emissions, noise, and transportation. But it did result in greater impacts to cultural resources in terms of impacts on historic buildings and utilities and service systems because of the increased amount of development. Next slide. So I just want to reiterate that tonight, the purpose of tonight's hearing is really to receive comments on the draft EIR. We will respond to the comments in detail in the final document. So, you know, we're happy to answer questions of the commission or our speakers, but really in terms of looking at the analysis, methodology, et cetera, we look forward to providing those responses in the document itself. That concludes our presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. At this point, I'll ask for any questions of clarification. We'll save the discussion for after the public hearing, but any questions of clarification from any of the commissioners? Go ahead. Yeah, Commissioner Davidson.
I have a question. How was the number of employees projected to increase in the next 20 years? How was that number formulated?
On to that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So the projections, it depends on which scenario you're looking at. The no project alternative was using old projections for San Rafael that anticipated more employment growth, and those were embedded in the previous general plan. The three alternatives that we looked at had almost the same employment growth. In other words, the project plus alternatives B and C had almost the same level of employment growth, and that was based on a more current set of projections from ABAG for the year 2040, plus some data about where land was located that could support future employment. So it was sort of a top-down, bottom-up balancing of how that growth that was forecast would be distributed across the city.
Commissioner Sadi.
Yeah, first I want to just thank you guys for the report. It was really extensive. It was really long. It was good. I had a couple questions. One of them was similar to Commissioner Davidson's, so I'll start with that one. But with projecting population, and there were some sections about like infrastructure in terms of like schools and other buildings. Like, how would that? Can you basically explain to us how you come up with the numbers in terms of like what type of population would be make up the growth?
Yeah, I can respond to that. So we have data on the number of housing units in over that 20-year period that would be single family or multifamily based on the land use designation. So if they're in downtown, they're likely to be multifamily units because that's the way the zoning and densities would work. And then there are multipliers that actually all of the school districts use to generate how many students would come out of a multifamily unit versus a single family unit versus a townhome, et cetera. And those are applied, and those are, by the way, those are based on the actual enrollment and the number of units in the community. And those are applied to the future increment of growth based on the unit types. So it's really just a matter of taking multipliers and the unit types and projecting it out over the 20 years.
Yeah, and I mean, this may be getting to the minutia, but we are like closing certain schools within like, at least within San Rafael City schools. So does this report and the general plan impact the way that we treat those sites if we hold them as like childcare centers and then they eventually become schools when we need them? Or how do we apply these metrics to like real life properties that are being impacted today because of declining enrollment?
Sure, it's a great question. And I would say we coordinated all of this with the school district. So they also have demographers that do forecasting based on school closures and determine when school closures are needed. So all of that information is reflected in the analysis that was done here, and they had an opportunity to review the recommendations. So we're, the forecast of number of students is most of their projections don't go out to 2040. The demographic forecasting for schools tends to be much shorter range. But we've worked with them to make sure that the numbers that are in our forecasts align with their own projections for their facilities. And I don't know that I don't know if there's a specific school you had in mind, or
No, I think it's like a short school.
Right.
They closed it, and I know that, like, I just keep on top of, at least for Sandersville City Schools, like what's happening with them, and there is declining enrollment, and there's a lot of attrition because of, this year because of COVID. I don't know how much we'll get, more students back in the district, but when I was reading that portion of the report, I just was wondering how that all kind of like played out at the schools.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And school enrollment forecasting is especially tricky, because what we've seen is that the enrollment has not been driven by development in the last 10 years. It's been driven by demographics. And so, it's hard to predict, because it's easier to predict the number of units we're going to have in the next 20 years than what the demographics of the city will be. So, it's a lot of unknown.
It's a lot of turnover of properties. And then, if you don't mind, I have two more questions, and then I can pass it over to my other commissioners. But one of the things about wildfire, I think this went back to like natural resources, or I forget the exact section, but there was a discussion, there was a chapter about basically environmental analysis, but it didn't really discuss like removal of non-invasive species. I think it talked about like maybe, native species and protecting native species. But we do have like a number of open space areas that have like a great deal of eucalyptus that are invasive, and that also contribute to our wildfire risk. And I wonder if that was how that played into the EIR. And I may have missed it, but it'd be good to hear just if there's any plans to like address that.
Yeah, I can start with that, and maybe Tarina, you could finish as well. But when we look at each of these chapters, we look at all the policies that are regulating that topic. So in terms of invasive species, we know that the Water District has very strong policies and regulations for invasive species control, and that we know, eucalyptus pose a danger, and all of that information in terms of is reflected in the regulatory environment in terms of both county and local efforts to prevent, to maintain, safe distances, to reduce invasive species that have high fire content. So that's all taken into consideration. It is in the wildfire chapter, more so than biology. That would be probably the other chapter you were thinking about. But this would be in the wildfire chapter in terms of really looking at invasive species from that safety perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I think I was looking at the biology one. And then I guess this is like a minor question, but the nesting birds issue is, I just had a question about whether or not there's specific species that we look at, or if it's just any nesting birds. Because I've been on projects where that's been an issue. But do we have like specific species of birds, or is it just any nesting bird?
The genesis for the mitigation measure is from the Wildlife Species Treaty Act, which is a federal act that affects each state. And there are species that are specifically listed in that act to be protected. It includes a lot of raptors and other, birds of that nature. So it has, I would say, it's kind of, because it was kind of lessened at the federal level, it's taken on more significance at the local level and tends to be more general. But it really does look at, hawks and eagles, other, peregrine falcons, other types of birds that do tend to nest in trees. And, where you do the pre-development, construction surveys to make sure that the nesting isn't there at the time. It's a protective ordinance as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair, you had your hand up too.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a few clarifying questions. The first one is related to cultural impact and specifically tribal resources. I know that the locations of tribal artifacts are, for the most part, confidential in order to prevent disturbance of those artifacts. And I'm just wondering if the draft EIR took into consideration those confidential locations to ensure that they wouldn't be disturbed. That's my first question.
Yes, that is correct. That information is available to the archaeologists, the consultants who worked on this project, and so they are aware of that, those sources.
Okay, thank you. My next two questions are related to air quality. The first one is around diesel particulates associated with the SMART train and other future trains on that track. And I'm just wondering if, the possibility of more emissions given more frequent train routes along that track were considered in the draft EIR.
No, the modeling for emissions looks at it looks at things from a more the basis of the emissions model itself. It doesn't necessarily, it does take into consideration many assumptions. Vehicle fleet mix is a really big consideration in terms of cars shifting to electric and that type of thing. But in terms of the baseline operations, it would be looking at operations as they are today and would not consider increases in the SMART train as part of the future level, except other than looking at it from a cumulative perspective in terms of the Bay Area air quality, their projections for future. But it wouldn't look at it as a specific assumption under the modeling for the EIR for San Rafael General Plan.
Okay. My next question is around parking. So one of the things that is pretty apparent in San Rafael is that parking is insufficient for high density housing areas like apartments. And so I'm wondering if the draft EIR looked into surveys, for instance, that suggested the number of cars per unit for particularly high density housing areas.
So we didn't look into surveys, but the EIR includes, and the general plan includes policies to really look at ways to reduce automobile dependency over time and to reduce the ratio of parking for future residential development. Not necessarily through surveys, but transportation demand management is a very important component in reducing vehicle miles traveled, which are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. And through the policies and programs in the general plan itself, looking at the proximity to the SMART train, other ways of providing transportation without parking, of all of those policies kind of coalesce for that same goal, to really reduce the number of parking that's required for multifamily residential.
I just want to piggyback on that as well. Thanks, Steve, which is, some of this came from the parking and wayfinding study, and it was looked at not through the CEQA lens really, but as just kind of a more transportation planning component of the downtown precise plan. So looking at what those parking standards needed to be was part of that process. So we did consider that and plan for that, and it is part of the precise plan for downtown, but it's not really treated as an EIR issue for that, for CEQA purposes.
I understand. Thank you.
And Paul wants to say something as well.
The CEQA guidelines were amended some years ago to remove parking from the list of impacts that are assessed. So I just want to mention that wasn't mentioned earlier, but up until I think around 2012, 2013, parking was considered an impact under CEQA, and it no longer is. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I should have mentioned that I was also asking in the context of emissions, vehicle emissions, obviously. So, my last question is around, also around wildfire risk. And as folks know, there are a number of communities in San Rafael that are in wildfire-prone areas, particularly hillsides, without access to emergency vehicles because of the size of the streets and the tightness of the curves. And I'm just wondering if CEQA covers, or if it's within CEQA's scope of work to address alternate or secondary escape routes, essentially, like roads that people could use to leave those areas in the event of fire.
Okay, I can start with that, and maybe Barry, if there are general plan policies that are looking at those hazards in terms of long-term solutions, you can talk about that. But really what we're looking at here more are the impacts of future growth on the city. So, it would be assumed that as that development were to occur, they would not be under the same conditions that were allowed at the time that those projects came in. That being said, we're still looking at the ability of the fire department and others to provide services with growth, but uniform services throughout the city. So, that's something that would also then be addressed at the general plan level in terms of future development, avoiding that type of mitigation. I don't know if there are other policies in the plan that look at long-term solutions to the existing conditions as well or not.
Yeah, there are some policies that in the safety element that deal with evacuation routes and with the narrow street and turning radius issues. There's also quite a lot more in the local hazard mitigation plan and also other emergency preparedness plans that the fire department and more of the public safety side of city operations would be looking at. It's a general plan issue, and it is addressed in the plan. Yeah, I mean, at a citywide level, not at the level of an individual street, or with measures to alter a particular road, but it's really more implementing actions that make sure that that becomes a consideration when development is approved or considered in the future. And there are a number of follow-up plans and measures that are included in the general plan that will look at that.
Yep. Great, thank you very much.
Do we have other clarification questions? No? Okay. At this point, then, I'll open up the public hearing and I'll ask staff to open up public comments, please. Allie, you're on mute.
Gosh, I had a whole paragraph that I just said. I do see some raised hands. I just want to remind everyone that if you are wishing to speak on this agenda item, At this time, you can press *9 to virtually raise your hand, and I'll let you know when it is your turn to speak. You'll have the ability to unmute yourself by pressing *6, and you'll be allowed to speak. Remember to keep your comments to 3 minutes, and then make sure you have the volume on any other device turned off to avoid feedback or delays. So I'm going to go ahead and start here. Lindsay, it looks like you're on.
Oh, good. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay. My name is Lindsay Crump. I'm president of San Rafael Heritage. And we're here to work with the city to be active in support of the city's objectives as we pursue our goal of historic preservation. That is, of course, with the city's cultural resources. We have previously submitted our formal written comments that will be included in the record for this meeting. I'll summarize them right now. The essence of our effort is to promote the interests of the broader San Rafael community. We support the city's many actions favoring historic resources. Besides providing incentives for preservation, you are elevating preservation as an urban design and placemaking tool, recognizing that historic buildings support a shared collective memory and improve the quality of life for residents and visitors. We are sensitive to the cost constraints of the city also. Some of our comments address this issue directly. We support policies that encourage good economic development and also promote historic preservation because we know intelligent preservation has a profound economic benefit to the downtown business area. While there are many policy and regulatory approaches to historic preservation, we are most familiar with Redwood City's experience. As such, it provides a basis for a number of our observations and recommendations. Even with our own limited resources at Heritage, we intend to continue to provide timely input on the historic inventory, rating of resources, input to survey areas, and provide recommendations for the refinement of proposed district boundaries. We will continue this work with the Planning Commission prior to the consideration of these documents by the City Council. In order to facilitate the implementation of the Downtown Precise Plan, we have addressed development standards with the consideration of setting the right balance between historic preservation priorities and providing sufficient flexibility and incentive for project proponents. We also recommend the formation of a San Rafael 5-member Historic Resources Advisory Committee based on the Redwood City model, with 5 members appointed by the Planning Commission. This committee's work would be vital to successful, meaningful city planning. The committee's function would keep a narrow focus on historic preservation as defined by the municipal code and the precise plan. In recognition of funding limitations, we recommend using preservation mitigation fee exactions for support of various historic preservation activities. For example, updates to the historic resources inventory and staff support for a historic resource advisory committee. Lastly, we recommend the inclusion of a concise context summary statement in the Downtown Precise Plan policy. San Rafael Heritage has observed a key contextual defining characteristic of downtown San Rafael, namely its center at 4th Street and B Street. Here are unusually intact examples of a prosperous small American Main Street. There are good quality representative buildings from each stylistic period from the mid-19th century through to the present. These urban design characteristics shall inform future downtown development. Thank you. That's the end.
Good evening, Commissioners. This is Jeff Rhodes, and I will be followed by Leslie Simons, who will also speak. It may seem counterintuitive that Sanderfell Heritage would advocate for modifications to the Downtown Precise Plan form-based code that result in less restrictive standards for new construction in historic building sites and districts or adjacent to them. A significant majority of our steering committee supported this position, although it was not a consensus. To be fair, I was an advocate based on what I observed while serving on the Redwood City Historic Resource Advisory Committee from 2013 to 2017. The take home from that experience is new development and historic preservation are mutually dependent. Restored and successful occupied historic buildings contribute to the character and place of downtown, and new development powers the economic engine that makes downtown successful and restoration economically feasible. From a dollars and cents standpoint, purchasing a downtown Sanderfell historic building and restoring it to rentable condition costs approximately $500 a square foot. A robust economy is required to make restoration feasible. Considering the challenges that we face post-pandemic, we need to prime our engine. In Redwood City's case, the dramatic increase of apartments, office space, and restaurants was made possible by its location in the Silicon Valley and a well-conceived and not overly restrictive DTPP. It's for this reason we recommend applying Redwood City standards here while respecting the overall height limitations in Sanderfell's draft DTPP. Consider this beta test of the new development standards. According to Paul Jensen, the mixed-use project this board reviewed and approved on the northwest corner of B and 2nd Streets would not conform to the DTPP as written. This places disincentives for new projects on or adjacent to designated and contributory historic buildings and districts. In my conversation yesterday with Mayor Colin, she expressed support for historic preservation, but not at the detriment of achieving the key objective of the City Council, simplifying and accelerating the approvals process to jumpstart desirable downtown development. We don't wish to foster an environment that will discourage designation and restoration of historic landmarks and districts. Development standards that are punitive will do just that. We're realists. Our goal is to elevate the importance and presence of historic buildings in a successful downtown. This means implementing the Downtown Precise Plan with an appropriate balance of standards and incentives to motivate property owners to restore historic buildings and build great new projects throughout downtown Sanderfell. Fussy standards for transitioning new construction building form adjacent to resources and districts won't achieve this balance. New additions to block form buildings behind the step backs that are required by the code should also not be overly restrictive. We realize that this will result in cases where taller new buildings are built next to smaller historic ones. We recognize there's a trade-off that results from achieving a balance. Thank you. I trust you all heard that.
Yes, we did. Thank you.
Okay.
Leslie, go ahead and.
Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry, I'm in a funny place and I didn't, my mouse isn't hitting the right spot. Hi, my name is Leslie Simons. Sanderfell Heritage has been working with city staff and the consultant team to provide, a local perspective and knowledge in the historic resource inventory. In general, we concur with most of the 2020 inventory. However, our findings include some recommendations for additions, deletions, and rating modifications. Specific suggestions in a spreadsheet that show all and their relationship to the 1978 inventory will be sent soon to clarify what we would like to see. In the DEIR, a process should be created to improve the method of rating resources and offer a clear path to landmark designation for landowners who rehabilitate and restore their buildings. Provide access to incentives afforded by local landmark designation and, when possible, state and federal listing. The urban design objective is to improve streetscapes through an enhancement of what might not today be considered landmark worthy. An example would be the Marin Municipal Water District building in 874 4th Street. This could include the removal of the storefront addition, creation of a private plaza in its place, and transfer of height and bulk to the rear of the property. An E-rated resource could move up to an A or B rating, with the owner benefiting from restoration incentives, including tax credits, mills tax contracts, and facade easements. It will be necessary to modify the graphics as shown in this EIR as relates to the historic core and inventory list to conform to the proposed revisions. An example is the resource shown on the northwest corner of 4th and E, now occupied by Istanbul Rugs. This rating should only include the former automobile dealership on the corner, not the adjacent buildings on both 4th and E. We also recommend adjustments to the historic district boundaries to conform to areas with a cohesive context. As shown, they reach out to individual resources where mitigation measures are adequately addressed in the DEIR without inclusion in a district. Boundaries should be established to maintain and emulate the traditional Main Street character of 4th and B, with buildings fronting directly on the sidewalks, focusing the proposed districts on those streets. We also note there are no specific actions, procedures, or timetables identified to establish historic districts and would like to see this addressed. More detailed specific recommendations are listed in our letter of March 5th. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. Go ahead and press *6 to unmute yourself and you should be able to talk.
Good evening. This is Bill Carney. I'm Chair of Sustainable San Rafael. Great to see you all this evening. The fact that the draft EIR finds the greenhouse gas impacts of the General Plan 2040 to be, quote, significant and unavoidable is a real wake-up call for San Rafael to increase its actions to reduce climate change. The DEIR projects a 20% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2040, while stating that a 60% reduction by then would be required to meet state law. Contrary to the report's statement, these greenhouse gas impacts are not unavoidable. Economically feasible ways to reduce emissions by 60% are already widely available in Marin in all of the emission sectors that the DEIR lists. For example, fossil-free electricity, electric heat pumps and appliances, electric vehicles, and organics recycling. So we request that you recommend the mitigation of these significant greenhouse gas impacts by adding some clarifying and strengthening language to the general plan. Number one, a new program clarifying that the climate action plan will be updated at least every 10 years, adjusting programs to assure implementation of greenhouse gas goals, including reductions of 40% by 2030, 60% by 2040, and to 2050 levels that conform with state requirements. Secondly, strengthening the general plan program reducing natural gas use to not just promote, but to actually implement electrification of building systems and appliances. Thirdly, strengthening the EV plan program of the general plan to both develop and to implement a zero emission vehicle plan, including a goal of 60% adoption of EVs by 2040. And finally, strengthening the community composting program in the general plan to not only, quote, consider, but to, again, implement a mandatory community scale program for curbside collection, composting, or other low emission conversion of food and green waste in compliance with SB 1383 requirements. So by implementing low emission building electrification, transportation, and waste management as mitigations to General Plan 2040, the required 60% reduction of greenhouse gases is readily achievable over the 20-year lifespan of the plan, placing San Rafael in a solid trajectory, towards carbon neutral. As the DIR makes clear, it is now necessary for the city to step up to systemic solutions to climate pollution via these more robust programs and requirements with supporting ordinances and incentives finalized as soon as possible, we would say by 2025. To assist that effort, model ordinances already exist from the state, county, and other jurisdictions, along with the incentive programs at MCE, CAM, and other partner agencies. Finally, we also think it would be helpful to hear the EIR consultants tonight clarify how the 40% greenhouse gas reductions itemized in San Rafael's CCAP, the Climate Action Plan 2030, how that goal figures into the conclusions reached in the DEIR. Overall, we commend the General Plan 2040 and the Downtown Precise Plan for recommending a comprehensive range of actions to address both climate change and other issues shaping the city's future. Thank you very much.
And I do not see any more raised hands. I'm going to go ahead and give it one last try. If you're wishing to speak and you're on a call, go ahead and press *9 and I will unmute you. I do not see any more, and I do not see anybody on chat. Oh, I see one more raised hand. Go ahead and press *6 to unmute yourself.
Hello, this is Kate Powers. I wanted to just emphasize Bill's comments about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. I think not only are we in a climate crisis, but the urgency with which the climate effects are happening are more and more evident every year. 2020 had more hotter and more wildfires than any previous year, with 4 million acres burned. And I think as a city, we have to take reducing our greenhouse gas emissions seriously. And so I endorse the recommendations that Sustainable San Rafael made. The other thing that I wanted to comment on was in the general plan, there's a wetland overlay district, and the County of Marin has a Baylands corridor instead along the Baylands. And there are several environmental groups that would like to see the city adopt the Baylands corridor to be consistent with the countywide Baylands corridor. That would include current habitat that would have potential for future restoration or enhancement, have flood control benefits, and enable adaptation to sea level rise impacts. And so We would like to see the EIR discuss the benefits of adopting a Baylands corridor as it is identified in the countywide plan. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was that Plan Bay area, the numbers that San Rafael is projecting for growth for both population and jobs are a little different in Plan Bay area. Plan Bay area for Marin County in general is projecting a 3% growth through 2050 and a 14% decrease in jobs. And so I personally think that in the, in the section where there are alternatives, I support reducing the population projections to alternative C. Although that one, I just think that by adding more people than what is projected in Plan Bay area and not having a very efficient and effective flexible route transit system, we're adding more people to the roads and more greenhouse gases. And until we have the infrastructure to support increasing the population by the amounts that are in the general plan, I think that it goes against the greenhouse, the state, the nation's, the world's efforts to quickly get to a point where we are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And cities produce 70 to 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions around the world. It's our responsibility as cities to act responsibly. Thank you.
And again, if you're wanting to speak, go ahead and press *9 to raise your hand. I didn't see one more there. Go ahead and unmute yourself to talk.
I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Brad Sears. Let's see, where do I start? Since my time's limited, I'd like to focus on two aspects of the draft EIR. This is my thoughts related to the staff report. First, recataloging the historical inventory without acknowledging the historical properties north of Mission as a historical district in itself is a mistake. All three properties, the Boyd Gatehouse, the Boyd Mansion, and its original unmolested carriage house, which I think is probably the largest carriage house in the North Bay, and the Falkirk are continuous. Were this plan of any real use to preservationists like myself, the Mills Act and adopting the historical building code would further preservation instead of just counting it or cataloging it. Secondly, I was unable to find any mention of the effects of the pandemic in the staff report and the massive shifts in society. I consider this a hallmark of denial, and I intend to take it up as a subject in a Marin Post article prior to the plan's ratification, along with a summary of how the DRB was eviscerated. Surveys, questionnaires, and conclusions did not reflect new realities, but the process marches on, oblivious to the changes in work, shopping, transportation, urban exodus, building ventilation design, and behavioral patterns, which will probably not change. Pre-pandemic poll findings that legitimate this report are stale and did not include anything but positive and leading options. Otherwise, one could not submit the survey. In fact, one required a knowledge of Spanish to complete. Lastly, I will call upon Mr. Miller to include a multi-angle and distance visual representations at the bookending of the West End Village, including the maximum height bonuses, and an analysis and inclusion by a third party of the survey's findings of the surveys and their findings. The corner of 4th and E Street is a high point in town and will be a visible insult to the community if an apartment is too tall. I suggest shading studies be mandatory for any buildings over 3 stories. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Just looking to see if there's anybody else wishing to speak. So raise your hand or press *9. I do not see any others. And I do not see anything in chat. So there's no more. That's all.
Okay, thanks. At this point, we will close the public hearing, and we're going to circle back to the commissioners and we'll ask them follow-up questions and have our discussions at this point. I think we'll kind of just leave it as a free-for-all at this point, just to kind of walk through any high-level points, discussion points, questions that you have from there. We'll start with you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So I liked Sustainable San Rafael's suggestion that we aim for a 60% target. And I'm just wondering if their recommendations could be considered. I think it would be actually in the 2040 plan as opposed to the draft EIR, if I understand correctly. No need for discussion unless others would like to discuss that, but that was my sentiment.
I could just clarify on that point, Commissioner Previtali, that the general plan actually does include the 60% target. So that's there for 2040. What the EIR is finding is that the sum of all of the policies and actions in the plan may not get us there. So I think that is really where the gap is are there more proactive measures that are needed to get to 60%? But that is the target both in the climate action plan and in the general plan.
Okay. Do you think it may be feasible to add some of the recommendations from Sustainable San Rafael to the 2040 plan to try to fill that gap?
We'll have to take a look
as goals.
Right. We'll have to take a look at those and the proposed wording in the response process.
Okay, great. Thank you. Similarly, I thought that San Rafael Heritage had some very good suggestions as well, and I know we've heard from them before. I'm just wondering if their suggestions could be recommended or could be considered as well in the 2040 plan.
Yes, and there again, a lot of their suggestions are for the downtown precise plan specifically. So we would be working with Opticos on how we can accommodate some of their recommendations and suggestions, with the assurance that making those changes will not have a significant impact on historic resources that hasn't been identified in the EIR. So that's really the test of how. When we make changes to the precise plan, we need to consider the impacts of those changes on the conclusions that were reached by the EIR. So we'll go through that process as part of the response to comments.
Okay, thank you. And along the same lines, I thought it was intriguing the comments by, I believe his name is Mr. Sears, regarding properties with historic value north of Mission, and I'm just wondering if that could be addressed, and also to extend even farther north. I'm wondering if the EIR communities in Terra Linda are considered historic in nature and have special preservation rights.
I can respond to part of that. There's also a kind of a part 2 to your answer, which is related to an overlay district that exists in that area. With respect, the overlay district is in the Terra Linda area, but with respect to going across Mission, we actually intentionally drew the downtown precise plan boundary to exclude areas where we were not wanting to encourage additional developments of the Falkirk Mansion and some of the other large properties that are on the north side of Mission were not included in the plan area, because this really was a plan about growth and development and where we wanted to rezone property to accommodate more density and more multi-story development. And those areas, given that they are historic and have that character, were the line was essentially drawn to not include them. This is not to say that they shouldn't be recognized as important historic resources. They absolutely are, and there is more that can be done, but not within the context of the downtown precise plan. And yeah, with respect to the North San Rafael, Eichler areas, that and Allie or Paul may want to chime in on this too in terms of the overlay. They're acknowledged in the general plan as a character defining feature of the neighborhood and a really important element of the landscape in North San Rafael and something we want to preserve. But there's nothing in the general plan that says that that is a future or current historic district or proposed to be listed as a district in the same sense as what's being discussed downtown.
Okay, thank you. And then my last comment and question is that I thought that the speaker who recommended that we adopt the county Baylands corridor had a really good idea, and I was wondering if that may be feasible.
Yeah, we'll certainly look at that. On the surface, it seems like something that makes a lot of sense. So we'll have a look at that, the county corridor, and see if it can be incorporated as an action item in the general plan. Again, probably not an EIR change, but it would be a general plan change.
Great, thank you very much.
Do you have any other commissioners with comments or questions? Yes, Commissioner Davidson.
I have a question regarding the greenhouse gas emissions, given that traffic was one of the main contributors and COVID did reduce traffic patterns significantly. And I'm just wondering how the traffic generated greenhouse gas emissions were projected over the 20 years. Did COVID affect those projections?
No, so the base data would have been from April 2019, or I think May 2019. So it was before the pandemic, and then the forecasting would not have taken into consideration any changes that are happening or that happened in 2020, 21 related to the pandemic. So that would not be a factor in those forecasts, as far as I know. And Steve, correct me if I'm off on that.
No, you're correct, Barry.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if these are very high numbers then being used, because just discussions among employers and just workforce, it seems like we're not projected to go back fully to the way we used to conduct business. So I'm just wondering if there should be an analysis for reduced traffic greenhouse gas emissions.
I can just jump in. I think that, nobody really knows. And at this point, there are many variables. Anecdotally, people are not taking public transit. So you could have a lot more traffic in the long run if people aren't using public transit during this time. So it's very difficult to try to assess whether or not what we see now will have a long-term effect or not. And so at this point, using the baseline from pre-COVID is the best way to estimate kind of the worst case conditions, in terms of the most conservative effort of it, or conservative projections on impact.
Commissioner Sadi?
Yeah, I'll start with reiterating some of the comments that were made by Commissioner Parvatali and Commissioner Davidson. I do think I will support the comment regarding the Baylands corridor and being consistent with the county. I think, you know, Barry, you've already addressed that, but I think that that's a really smart thing to try to do so that we have, we're contributing to the overall plan the county has and that we have a coordinated effort there. I also, you know, do think that we are looking at a hybrid workplace future. I can't, you know, I think the employers that felt like we all had to be in person now understand how much we can get done at home. And I would say we're not naive to think that we'll be at home forever, but I do think that there'll be a lot more flexibility, especially in the Bay Area, where we can be at home a few days a week. And so I think there was a caller, I forget who it was, who had discussed, you know, post-COVID impacts. And I do realize the EIRs and the draft, you know, these take several years to conduct and the data just isn't out there. But I think we'd be remiss to try to, you know, not take some time to scan the document and look at what our post-COVID world may change. And that's not to say we have to change all the language, but just looking at what's there and speculating into the future, because this isn't this is like a guiding document, right? And then I think the other thing that I wanted to discuss was, you know, the alternates for population growth. We did have a caller discuss, you know, going with the reduced population. And I personally would feel like we should go with Alt B, which is greater residential growth. I think we know that we all have concerns about carbon emissions, and we should definitely try to figure out measures where we can meet the 60% reduction in requirement, and that I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. To say that it's not, you know, that we're going to reduce housing in our city because we don't want to have the carbon emissions is pushing that problem to other communities. It's not helping to solve the problem. So if we can take on the housing crisis and be leaders in that, and also at the same time work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're helping to be part of the solution instead of pushing that onto somebody else. So I do feel strongly about that. And I just believe that we also need to be, what, you know, the EIR is showing what the impacts are for these population growths, but we definitely need to make it more streamlined for businesses and developers, and to really be able to put San Rafael into like the best 2040 it can be. And that is encouraging business, having smart growth, doing it in a way that is ecologically sensitive and restoring our community, but also really addressing some of the issues that impact us with equity, and really we probably have the most disparate or diverse population in Marin. And I think that there's a real opportunity there. So as much challenges as we have, we do have a really great fabric to work from. And I think that, you know, making sure that we don't kind of push things aside to make it easier on us is, I just don't think that's the right solution. So that's my comment.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Commissioner Davidson?
I have a process question. At our last meeting, we heard the Tiscornia Marsh Restoration Project, and they're also doing an EIR on that project. And I'm wondering, since that is part of the a key component in addressing sea level rise, the whole levee that goes from the Sanderfell Canal all the way to the bridge. Was that analyzed as far as some sort of a retrofit to that levee in the 2040 EIR? Because if it is, I don't foresee having a separate full EIR when the next segments of that restoration come, which I'm hopeful it's going to be in the next 20 years.
Yeah, I can respond to that. And I saw Steve pop on for a minute. I didn't know if he wanted to say something about that. Yeah, I would just say that at the general plan level, we're looking at citywide impacts of a development program that is a certain number of homes and jobs across the city. So the kind of improvements, like a specific change to a portion of the shoreline associated with a project, would not really be something that we would be analyzing unless it was specifically a general plan component or project. And in this case, the marsh restoration, although it's referenced in the general plan, it's not being done because of the general plan. So the EIR itself would not have looked at that project.
Yeah, that's correct.
I want to ask some comments on that, if I could. Steve, if you don't mind, I would like to just make a comment. The general plan includes a very specific program to pursue an adaptation plan for sea level rise. And as part of that planning, we'll do separate CEQA review. We're not quite there yet. So projects like the Tiscornia Marsh, which is a one-off project, a very good project, a one-off project. It's not going to solve the greater issue. It's going to have to continue to be analyzed on its own merits at this point and its own CEQA review. But we do have a program in the general plan that calls for the greater adaptation plan, which will be subject to CEQA. And we're just, this EIR is at a program level, our general plan EIR, so it's not prepared to analyze that level of detail, as Barry indicated. Sorry, Steve, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I don't have any other comments. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm going to weigh in with a comment. So this builds upon what Commissioner Saudi mentioned regarding population density. And I completely agree with her that, we shouldn't try to reduce population density and essentially push the problem to other communities. I think we should, as she mentioned, try to solve the problem. And I'm actually on a task force where I work on transformation of the transportation infrastructure to electric. And I've learned that, as folks may know, 30% of all emissions come from transportation. And it's a very difficult problem to solve, obviously. People think more difficult than emissions that come from buildings because of the mobile nature of vehicles. And one of the things that I've noticed in San Rafael, and I alluded to this earlier in the conversation, is that there is a lot of street parking for high density neighborhoods. And I just don't understand how we could support electric vehicles for people who park on the street. And I'm just wondering if anyone has thought about that. It's maybe a problem that we should discuss later on if there's no immediate solution. But it seems like one of our biggest problems is going to be people, needing to work in places where there's not immediate access to public transportation. Like, for instance, I don't really think, I'd be interested to know if, how many people go to work in places where they can't use the train or a bus or whatnot. I mean, obviously, it's pretty easy to get to San Francisco using public transportation, but I suspect a lot of people who live in San Rafael don't work in San Francisco, particularly folks who park on the street. And so I'm just wondering if there may be any solution to helping those folks get into electric vehicles that could be charged. If there's if no one has any good answers to this, maybe it could be just a topic that the group could consider and get back to us on. I know it's a hard problem to solve.
I think it's an interesting issue. I don't think it's the conversation for tonight, though, but I think it's something that I hope staff kind of hears, because I think that's a really interesting issue. My only thought, I think, for tonight would just be that we hear some really good comments. And so to Barry and the team, I'm excited to hear how those are considered, and for the next follow-up session, sort of what thoughts, if any, come into it. I had nothing specific on the EIR itself or the way it was presented. Again, I think you guys are doing a great job. I think there's some really interesting, complicated issues with how you look at COVID and the implications on it. And I'm interested to know in the 5 or 10 year revisiting where we are and how things actually align. I think it'll be fascinating. The greenhouse emission issues, that's a really good point. I think that for the next meeting would be a really good conversation to have. I think I'd like a little more clarity maybe. So that one I think will come up, but everything else, I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I think the only real comment that I have is just sort of the topic specifically of reducing climate change. I know that there is an importance in sort of ecological consideration, but one thing that comes to mind is the fact that not to be fatalistic by any stretch, but there's limited scope that the city of San Rafael has in terms of limiting or reducing or reversing the global climate change that we're seeing. And I think just given the required nature of sort of widespread international coordination politically in order to realistically make the dramatic changes that need to be made to reverse what we're seeing, I would say that a more feasible or viable target would be more around climate change resiliency. So assuming that the effects and the changes that we are seeing are going to be ever present and permanent, what are the adjustments that we can make to preserve as much of of the wildlife and the environment that's important to us as we can? The other consideration is just from an economic development standpoint. We've also established that social equity and bringing more of the community to the table as economic stakeholders is also important. I think that to a certain degree, and I know that this is sort of a built-in part of the general plan, the fact that there are parts that are at tension, but I would say that one key area of tension is the fact that economic development requires high levels of energy input, both metaphorically as well as literally, in terms of being able to provide the resources to enable people to make these big leaps if they are experiencing achievement gaps or economic gaps, to make those big leaps. Just know that specifically emphasizing a regime that is targeted at reducing climate change impacts by default is going to require those who are at the wrong end of achievement gaps to stay where they are. And we've seen that pretty bluntly within COVID, how we saw dramatic reductions in pollution levels, but it also required, many billions of people across the world to stay home and to forego income, particularly the people that are the most vulnerable. So that's just one thing that I do want, both planners here as well as the community at large, who are participating in these conversations, to be aware of that. There are inherent conflicts, but I think the more that we push for one specific set of outcomes, especially if they're not feasible or realistic, is going to come at the expense of some other important goals, particularly investment in other members of the community who need and have been historically underinvested in. So that's just my only comment there. Any other last words from anybody? Okay. Okay. If not, I'll request a motion to for staff to accept the report and to provide feedback.
This is Commissioner Mercado. I will make the motion.
I'll second.
All right. Thank you. Any further discussion on this? Okay, hearing none, I'll ask staff to conduct roll call.
Commissioner Davidson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mercado,
Yes.
Commissioner Saudi,
Yes.
Vice Chair Privatali,
Yes.
and Chair Samudzi.
Yes. All right, thank you, everybody. Next, we'll move on to the director's report.
Okay, I don't have a whole lot. The next meeting that we have in March, on March 23rd, is you're going to be seeing an ADU ordinance coming to you. We have a draft that's been posted on our website, and you'll be receiving a report on that, along with some comments that we've received on what the community members that have looked at it so far think about this ordinance. And then the other thing I have is that we released the planning commissioners recruitments. We've had a number of applicants. It's still open. So if you know anybody that is interested, let them know, or if you don't, spread the news and encourage people to apply. And that is all I have.
All right. Any PC members have any communication? If so, do you have any comments or anything you wish to share? All right. Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank
you. Bye-bye.